There's something about preparing for a snowstorm that feels older than habit itself. You gather wood, clear the paths, and watch the sky change. The work narrows your focus in many ways, and it asks for attention rather than urgency. That was the rhythm I found myself in recently here in New England. I was stacking firewood and getting ready for what the weather would bring. When the snow finally arrived, it did what heavy snow often does. It closed things down. It pulled the edges of the world inward. And in doing that, it gave me time I do not always make for myself. This story that I'm about to share came out of that pause. I've always loved short stories. I love what they allow. A complete world held briefly and then released. And lately I've been listening to Malcolm Guite read from writers that he loves right here on YouTube. If you want to check out his channel, his last name is spelled Guite. And I love hearing him as he's letting the sound of older sentences do their magical work. Hearing those passages read aloud by him specifically reminded me that there's still room for writing that moves slowly, at least I hope so, and writing that pays attention to the place and to the movement and to the inner lives of beings who take responsibility for something small and tremendously real. That sort of listening gave me permission to try writing in that register myself, to see whether I could build a world with patience rather than momentum, to trust description, to trust that meaning can gather without being pointed out, so on the nose. The story you're about to hear took shape during the days when the snow kept me inside and outside obligations gleefully, mercifully fell away. It's the first piece of fiction I've shared on this channel. It's a complete story, and it's also an early one in the sense that it was written carefully rather than strategically. If you find yourself responding to it, I would welcome hearing what stayed with you. Maybe what felt clear and what felt uncertain, or simply what lingered on within you after you finished listening. Thank you for being here. I hope you enjoy the story. Mist lay over the gray marsh as if the day had forgotten to fully lift its eyelids. It clung to the reed tops and dulled the long pools until they looked like bits of tarnished metal set prosaically into the earth. The raised causeway that crossed the marsh ran on in a tolerant line, stone by stone, and it vanished by pallor at each turn. When the sun slid behind the low hills, the marsh did not grow dark all at once because the mist held a thin, uncertain light for a little longer, as though it could not decide whether to leave. The lantern tower stood on the lone rise of firm ground near the middle of the crossing, built of rough stone and narrow enough that a strong wind could make it speak. It had no name on any map. The creatures of the marsh knew it by its shape and by the way it changed at evening. Travelers knew it by the relief they felt when they saw it, even though often they could not quite say why. The heron arrived before dusk, as he always did. His legs moved with the same measured care that had carried him through countless seasons, and his wings stayed folded close, resistant against the damp. He paused at the tower's base, where the stone smelled of wet lichen, and he listened until the marsh settled around him. There were sounds that belonged to the place, and there were sounds that belonged to the hour, and he could tell the difference without thinking about it. He began to climb the winding steps inside the tower where the air was cooler, and the stones held the day's last chill. He lifted one foot, then the other, and his claws found the worn places in the stair where feet had pressed persistently onward before him. He did not hurry. He had never hurried, because hurrying was how a foot slipped, and a lantern fell, and a duty became a moment of ruin. At the half landing, he felt the ache that had been there for a week settled deeper into his left wing. It was a plain ache like a cold stone laid just so against bone. He stopped and set his breast against the wall until his breathing evened. He did not think of himself as old because he had always been himself, and time had changed him by degrees too small to mark in any single day. He noticed, however, that the pauses had grown longer, and he had begun to count them without meaning to. When he reached the lantern room, the mist had thickened outside the narrow slit windows. The marsh looked nearer than it was, and farther than it was, and the causeway seemed to waver in the muted light. The heron set down the small, smooth stone he carried, placing it on the edge beside the lantern housing. He had found it long ago in the riverbed above the marsh, and it fit his claw as if it had been made for him. Though some may have speculated otherwise, he did not believe the stone carried noteworthy power. He used it because it marked a beginning, and he liked to know where things began. He opened the flint box and lifted out the striker. The tinder inside smelled faintly of old ash and dry grass. He had dried it himself under summer sun and stored it carefully. As he touched it this evening, it gave slightly, as if kissed by dampness. He held still for a moment and listened again. From below came the soft tapping of quick feet against stone, and then a voice spoke from the doorway that led up into the tower's shadow. "Lantern keeper," the voice said, respectful without being afraid. The heron turned his head. In the doorway stood a young plover, small-bodied and sharp-eyed, with feathers that still carried the quickness of youth. The plover had been born on the marsh edge 2 springs ago. The heron remembered the nest because he remembered most nests, and he remembered the day the first thin call had risen from it. "You should not be here," the heron said. His words were plain because plain words suited the work attuned to him. "I saw the mist," the plover replied. "I came to see if you had need." The heron felt the old familiar tightening under his breast. It was not anger, and it was not fear, but something that sat uncomfortably close to both. He had tended the lantern alone for so long that help felt like an interrogation, even though he knew, with the part of his mind that watched itself, that this was foolish. "I have no need," he said. The plover stepped forward one careful pace, as if he respected the boundary between a room and a responsibility. "My wings are strong," the plover said. "I can climb. I can strike the flint. I can do what you do." The heron looked at him, and for a moment he saw himself as he had been, leaner and quicker, with the same certainty that a duty could be held by strength alone. Habit told him to protect the lantern as he would protect a nest. Another sense, slower and stranger, told him that protection could harden into possession. "You can do it," the heron said, and his voice softened despite himself. "You cannot carry it." The plover did not bristle. His eyes moved to the ledge and to the small counting stone, and then back to the heron's face, as if he sensed that it mattered without knowing why. Outside, the light thinned. The marsh made a sound that was halfway between sigh and hush as reeds bent under a shifting breeze. The heron went to the window slit and looked down the causeway. A pair of shapes moved in the mist, not birds, but two-legged travelers in cloaks, their steps cautious. They had waited too long, and now they walked with the look of those who were trying to remember a path they had only seen by day. The causeway forked near the old willow stump, and the wrong branch led into a stretch where stones sank underfoot. The heron returned to the lantern and set the striker against the flint. He struck once, and the spark came small and weak. He struck again, and the tinder smoldered for a breath, and then the damp took it. He could have pressed on, because stubbornness had also shaped his life. He thought of the ache in his wing and the dull throb in his foot from the climb. He thought of the two travelers at the fork, and how quickly uncertainty became panic as one settles on cold water. He looked at the plover. "I will need dry reed down," the heron said. "I will need it now." The plover's eyes widened slightly, not with triumph, but with readiness. He did not speak. He turned and ran down the steps, and his feet made a quick patter that had faded into the tower's deep. The heron stood with the flint in his claw and the tinder in the other. The waiting felt like standing on a thin edge. He listened to his thoughts reach for old arguments. He heard himself insist that the lantern should be lit by the one who had always lit it, and that a younger bird could be careless, and that carelessness would return nothing but calamity to him. Beneath those words, a simpler fear stirred. It told him that if another bird could light the lantern, then he could be left behind, and the marsh would forget him as his redundancy had been exposed. He breathed, and the tower's stone held him steady. The tower did not care who lit the lamp. The causeway did not care who cast the light. The travelers below did not care who held the flint. As he waited, something loosened, and it was not relief. It was the release of a grip that had grown overbearing. The plover returned with a bundle of reed down, tucked carefully in his beak, and a small twist of dry bark he must have found under the tower's lee. He set them on the edge without bumping the lantern housing, and he waited, still and attentive. The heron arranged the new tinder with care, and placed the counting stone where it always went. He held the flint ready. His wing ached again, and this time the ache made him earnest. "Strike," the heron said, and he offered the striker to the plover. The plover took it as if it were heavier than it was, and set the striker against the flint. His claws trembled once and then steadied. He struck, and the spark jumped clean and bright. The reed down caught, and the flame rose, small and eager. The heron cupped his wing around it to guard it from the draught that crept through the window slits, and together they brought the flame to the wick. The lantern's glass warmed. The wick took hold. The light spread within the housing like a patient thing waking at once. It brightened until it pressed against the panes and pushed a clear golden path out into the mist. The causeway below became readable again, stone upon stone, and the fork near the willow stump showed itself without trickery. The two travelers slowed, then turned with certainty, and their steps grew steadier as they moved toward the far rise. The heron watched until they passed beyond the nearest bend and vanished into the softened distance. The marsh did not change, but it became shaped and knowable, and that was enough. The plover looked at the ledge. His gaze rested on the counting stone. He hesitated, as if he waited for instruction, and then he reached out and lifted it. His movement was simple and exact, and the heron felt a warmth behind his ribs, like sunlight remembered on a cold morning. They descended together. The tower's steps felt different with another set of feet beside his own, and the sound broke an old story the heron had told himself about solitude being the same as faithfulness. At the base, the air smelled of wet earth and crushed reed stems. The lantern's light shone above them, and it made a pale circle on the mist where it met the night. The heron stopped where the tower's shadow fell across the path, and he turned to the plover. He held out the counting stone on his claw. In the dim, it looked ordinary, as stones always did. "You put it down when you begin," the heron said. "You take it up when the light holds." The plover closed his claw around the stone, and his grip was careful, as if he had been given something living. "I will remember," the plover said. The heron nodded once. He did not add more because the moment did not ask for more. The work had always been simple, and its weight had always been carried in the doing. They parted at the edge of the rise, the plover turning toward the reeds where he nested, and the heron walking toward his own roost near the river's slow bend. The mist folded back in behind them, softening the world's edges. Above, the lantern continued to burn, steady and untroubled, and its light fell across the marsh as if it had always belonged there. The heron paused once on his path and looked back. The tower stood dark beneath its own crown of fire, and the causeway lay pale and sure for as far as he could see. Then he went on, not lighter exactly, but more at ease with the weight he had carried, because the light was holding, and another pair of wings now knew how to keep it so. Thanks so much for listening to that. If anything in the story stayed with you, a moment, an image, a feeling, I'd really love to hear about it in the comments. It helps me understand what's resonating, of course, and it turns this into more of a conversation than just a read aloud. If you'd like to help support this kind of work financially, there are a few ways you can do that. You can click the thanks button if you're watching this on YouTube, or you can join a paid tier on Substack or Patreon. Both of those links will be in the description. And there's also a donation link on my website if that's easier for you. I will link that in the description as well. Of course, I know not everyone can support financially, but if you enjoyed this story, one of the most helpful things you could do, if you haven't already subscribed or hit the like button, you can do those, but you could also share it, either to your social media or just by sending it to someone you think might appreciate it. Either way, I am very grateful. Thanks again for spending all of this time with me here today. I will see you soon.